featured reader. I was at the poetry section of the Strand September last year when I saw our featured reader's name on the shelf, World. I read on the cover, as in having whorls, also world as in this world, where we dream of traveling all over. Poems, Ed Bok Lee, it said under the title. I opened to page 1. The title of the first poem read, All Love is Immigrant. The Strand made $60 more that day. Ed's poems resonate with those of us who are rooting for language, for us who are carefully unearthing to reclaim the roots of our countries, our families, ourselves. He writes from, and I quote, pain, love, and longing anger like ice cubes in warm beer. He makes us spiral, twist, and come full circle through his staggering voice. A personal favorite is his ode to Bruce Lee. Ed's book, World, which is available on our table outside, and maybe the Strand still, won a 2012 American Book Award and a Minnesota Book Award for poetry. His first book, Real Karaoke People, I love this title, won a 2006 PEN Open Book Award and an Asian American Literary Award. He holds an MFA from Brown University, has worked as a journalist, phys ed instructor, bartender, and translator, and teaches part-time at Metropolitan State University. He has shared his work on public radio and MTV, as well as in journals, anthologies, and on stages across North America, Europe, and Asia. He also writes fiction and plays. Dearest guests, please join me in welcoming personal favorite, Mr. Ed Bok Lee.
Thank you, Nakai, for that intro, and thank you to Dugan. Where are you? That's awesome. I think I know that street in Nebraska. And to Andre, Andrushka, spasibo za poezию. So I've been here all day, like some of you. Who's been here all day since the beginning? Yeah, you guys deserve a gold star. So I've been thinking for the last couple hours that there's this Mark Strand quote that's been running through my head. It's from the corners, ink runs from the corners of my mouth. I've been eating poetry again. And I think today's version might be ink runs from my ears. I've been listening to a lot of fucking poetry today. But it's awesome. This is a great festival. Thank you to the organizers for having all of us. Tatiana, Jeffrey, Nakai. This first one, I heard at some point that the Earth has like 70% water, and that when we're born, we're 70% water, and we slowly lose it, and we get down to about 60 by the time we're old, or even 50% if you're sick and old. So this is called The Other's Water. Light imprints itself upon ourselves. We dance the ballet of midwinter rabbits under full moon, shadowing the past amid strangers' futures. Culture records itself on sheet after sheet of sleep. Sometimes I wonder why I never dream of celebrities. My love does and is the more well-adjusted. I dream of trees whispering to foreign seeds, waking to a life lit lyrically. All liquid remembers where it came from, thus is song. You were sad that afternoon, so I drank happiness enough for both of us. Our love, the symmetry of days surrounded by sizzling snow and rain. I remember opening you with words before actually ever meaning a thing. You were a vision, and I the light, and I flooded into the dream you later watercolored, a stuffed animal building a driftwood fire in an oil drum by the sea. Wind, thrashing, hurricane, all desire locked in the body's ancient water is sweet, as it's never what you say, but the melody. A choral tapestry of infinitesimal bodies. To listen to any rain is to hear the history of love, in love with thick, wild grain. I have always loved to be fooled. To love to be fooled is the history of fools. To love history is the love of fools, and so on. The rain keeps changing its tune. I sip your lips by the window, savoring wisdom. So I've been hanging out with a lot of MFA students here, and they're furiously working on their manuscripts, as they should, that they're going to send out in the world, hurl at as many people in the world as possible. And so I'm going to read this. It's about a time when I was working on my first book in an attic, and I determined I would not leave that attic until the manuscript was done. And that lasted, of course, several years. And in that time, I would wake up at night and hear these stirrings in the walls, and at first I thought, oh, nice, squirrels. And then I started hearing chirping in the walls, and I thought, sparrows, cool. And then one morning, very early before it was light, I woke up and there was a bat swooping, and I realized at that point, for over a year, the walls had been infested with bats, and I'd just been living in denial. So we called the exterminator, or the landlord did, and he came and he fashioned these stocking-like fish nets around all the holes under the eaves, and so they flew out, and they couldn't come back in. So this is 4 orders of silence. The exterminator arrived to seal the crevices under our eaves with stocking-like fish nets. The bats fly out, he assured, and can't come back in. For days afterward, I listened to the infant bats, still trapped in the walls, their crazed mammalian mothers attacking a corner street lamp with claws and tiny teeth. By winter, only snow on black mountains. A coal train scraping past. Spice in my dead father's blue sweater. The last time he visited and asked me to oil a hinge in my heart. So this next one is a prose poem, and it's about a friend I had who introduced me to poetry, and died shortly thereafter. He was a Korean adoptee. I'm Korean American. My parents are from Korea. My mom is from now the North. My father from the South. And you know, he knew nothing about what it was to be Korean, let alone Asian American, and I knew very little back then too. And he introduced me to poetry, and he was an artist, and then he sort of just left, and it's a long story, but I feel like in many ways he introduced me not to poetry, but to the mead-like marrow that's in poetry, and that you need to it's sort of like he lived a very provisional life, and I remember at the time thinking, how's he gonna get to tomorrow, let alone that night? And he created all this art, and it just poured out of him. So he's left behind all these paintings and sculptures and journals full of poetry, and it just kills me that there's so many people like that whose work will just never really. He's in his early 20s, so his work just never got to achieve that point where he had the technical virtuosity to fulfill vision, he sees, he works. So this is documentation. Everyone thought we were gay because we fought and talked trash and then made up like brothers sharing a prison cell in heaven. What to make of two young Asian men back then, suspect for arguing art and poetry when the artist has long black hair and cheekbones like a bird of war. He read the first poem I ever showed anyone, said nothing. Then a day later left Rilke on the kitchen table to slap common sense out of me, page by page. I was just beginning to feel how the last third of the alphabet is thicketed, more complex than the first and second, maybe as the last third of life will be. He was dreaming in smoky pigments, and for days would chase them, literally splashing whole walls of abandoned warehouses to try to ignite some secret door to grace. This month in Chicago, I went back to that fungal bar that bought our phony 19-year-old chopsaki accents, then watched the sun fall like a bloody egg. In a Koreatown that now feels underwater, I understood that only the dead finally belong to their bodies. The rest of us change, and that friction is the blessed pain. And I promised Kim I'd write about you, a Thai stripper, much older, 25 or 26, with 3 other names depending on what you knew, who loved musicals, Basquiat, Munch, but couldn't seem to decide between us two, finally picking some dude in a red BMW throbbing gangster rap, and the flaws in our hearts were forever soldered brokenly together. She was lost, like so many other pretty Asian girls here cut their own soft flesh with that exotic double-edged sword, now barely a Vespa leaking blue smoke in a hot August wind. The next year, I tried my luck in Korea teaching English. But this time, when he and I met up and wept, it was over soju, not bourbon, and not for common disgrace, but a sighing sense of floating without having to swim. I found myself in the middle of the Daegu woman and him at a pojangmacha tent slurping rainy fish cakes. It was past dark. My interpretation slurred twofold, but for once I knew who I was and was not to myself. We'd been searching for his biological mother for 2 weeks. All he had was one brittle mimeographed document with his name and age from the orphanage, Pak Tae-young, 4 years old, which may or may not have been a fiction. The tiny, middle-aged Daegu woman wore pearl pink rubber slippers and spoke with a bright urgency in her teary, wide-open eyes. I could barely keep up her Shigol dialect like flying a kite in a sandstorm. On the second meeting, we visited her in her tiny apartment behind a middle school, where she boiled oxtail broth and cut vegetables in the kitchen. The social worker we were with got the Daegu woman's signature and informed her of the necessity of a blood test. We stayed behind and drank milky makgeolli rice wine seated on her yellow linoleum until a voice began to thread my brain. When I went to the bathroom, I saw through a cracked door an older woman dressed in white, bowing repeatedly, alone, weeping and muttering a gibberish as if the hoarse, bossy leader of a children's game. Later, I'd learned the tattooed lines on both the old mother and her grown daughter's wrists meant they were marked as mediums for the spirit world, shamans, or maybe just insane. It didn't matter. By then, the blood tests came back 96% in the negative, and we knew reality better, but even less of the truth. 3 days before he was scheduled to go back to the States, another call came in from the classified ad we'd placed, and this time it was a man. They sat across from each other at the cafe, both chain-smoking, as the man recounted stories involving the ambulance he drove now that he was sober, and the fire that took his wife and house years before. I was surprised. He let the man twice reach hard, tobacco-tawny fingers forward and touch his nose. The next afternoon, the man introduced us to his daughter, and by then, I wasn't sure. By appearances, they could have been siblings. I don't like to tell this story because you don't want your people to look bad when already their names and history are blackened, charred. But at dinner that night, the girl leaned over and informed me that her father had liver cancer and they needed $700. I chuckled, but he didn't when I told him, and signed over the $400 he had in traveler's checks, surely knowing we'd never see the old man and girl again. If the past is a rope to somewhere, it can also wrap your throat. He's dead 12 years, and I don't think of him every day anymore, or the 2 apartments we shared, the kitten that for 3 years remained unnamed before running away, or the many words and whole episodes of that crazy Tega woman's and man's lives. I now know I mistranslated. Others visit instead. But I know he's there in my searching, and not just him, but that old woman in white muslin I glimpsed behind that cracked door, speaking her own kind of poetry so the spirits wouldn't be so lonely. This morning, I listened to birds talking to one another about a snake that had apparently entered the yard. The scrub jays informed the finches, who informed the squirrels and the jackrabbits, and so on, as maybe it's always been. And I dimly recalled a story he told me during the first week of our friendship. As we drifted off to sleep, spinning, I asked if he had any memories of the homeland, and he spoke something of his birth father, who he thought was a barber, dying suddenly of some illness, yes, and a mother, beautiful, who did all she could to keep him. There was a sister, though, I can't remember if she was older or younger, and the wart on the back of his little hand burned off when first he arrived in America, the scar of which he always carried like an amulet. This part is true. All the rest is what I was sent to interpret for you. So I've been spending a lot of time in the desert whenever I can. I live spring semester in Minneapolis, and then the rest of the time, my family lives in New York, but I spend the rest of the time lately in Southern California, the deserts, the high desert, which is different than the low desert. And I wrote this next poem, Desert of Dreams. Just being there in the high desert, it's very rocky, there's a lot of boulders, and there's all these crazy yucca and Joshua trees, and you just realize how this used to be the rainforest 40,000 years ago. And before that, it was the bottom of the ocean. In the desert, burning, there is a dream, but no one can find it. God hid it in leaves eons ago, when that rainforest wore rivers like necklaces, and his parents were calling his name. So, too, at the center of my life stares a beautiful wound I love to wrap each night and awaken by the ocean. How are you guys holding up? So we had the benefit of going across the street because there's no coffee to be found in this building anywhere. I've looked all over. So we had a huge pot of really strong coffee, which I do not recommend downing on an empty stomach, because a lot of people haven't eaten either, like a cube of cheese. All right, so this next one I'm going to do for Nakashi, mentioned it while we were having coffee, because it has this part where, in some Asian cultures, especially Vietnamese, but in Korea too, they often put this condensed milk into the really dark coffee and stir it, and then add ice. Vietnamese coffee. Anyone ever had that? Café Sada. It's so good. So this is, it's not really about coffee, but that I can find it. That sweetness, that richness, I hope is a part of the poem. It's called Sweet Men. Atop their dresser mirror rested a 2x4. My father used to scratch his back and discipline us. That wood-grained eye knot like a cougar in the bush. Once, I threw seaweed into my sister's hair at lunch. These were summers of little worth remembering. He hoisted my wrist into the master bedroom and whacked the dull backside of my corduroys. I never once thought of my mother's pale skin splashing against my darker father's. How there, where my soul-sucking pleas and hands went useless, they must have sipped one another many hot nights to sleep. I do remember my mother in his bathrobe once savoring a stringy persimmon past midnight, drips onto stainless steel so slowly warped her wet black hair, never longer. Years later, my lover's scent layers my own. Zephyr, cream, dusk, all summer. I kiss her lids and take her more deeply in bed, cultivating sorrow, heart, fear, half prayer, waiting for the moment she begins to drown, so I can save her. Some hot days, I'll rise afterwards to the kitchen, craving condensed milk and scalded coffee, musical ice cubes in mugs for me and her, as my father once loved to sweeten my own silly tears. All right, I think I'm just going to do one more. So this is the book World, and the title poem, which is called World. I don't know if it started with this, but years ago I remember hearing this factoid that every 2 weeks the final living speaker of a world language passes away. And as Eduardo pointed out in the first reading today, language is I don't want to misquote him, language is a view of reality. And as we all know, there are many, many different kinds of languages with many different kinds of grammatical, syntactical frameworks. Some languages don't have a past tense. Some languages don't have a future tense. And so, thinking about this, I started thinking about my father, who went to school in South Korea when it was occupied by the Japanese. And he was one day given, this was 1910 to 1945, they were in South Korea, or no, in the whole of Korea. And there was no North or South back then. And so he was given a Japanese name and told he needed to use that Japanese name and couldn't speak Korean in school. None of his friends could speak Korean. And the Japanese were smart. They knew to colonize people, you first and foremost take away their language. Fortunately, it didn't hold, but it fucked him up for a long time. And then, of course, the Korean War happened, and he learned English and then came here. So I was thinking about language and you know how linguists estimate that by the year 2050, when a lot of you from the looks of it will be like in your 30s, of the 6,000 languages spoken today, 90% will have gone extinct. So your children will grow up in a world where 9 out of the 10 cultures and languages that exist now have evaporated. And of course, along with culture or language goes the culture and the cosmology, the ways of viewing and seeing and assigning values in the world. And not just that, but a lot of these languages are in the rainforest, they're native languages, and their knowledge of medicine and creation stories and history, an alternate history often to a Western view. So I was thinking about all these things, and so I wrote this. Oh, the last thing I'll say is, I read this poem once, and I never used to preface it, but people would say, "Well, what's so wrong? What's so bad about languages dying out? They've been dying out for ages, and then, they form into new languages like, Latin and the French, and eventually find their way through tributaries to English. But that's actually, technically speaking, a dead language. An extinct language the final living speaker evaporates. There's often no alphabet or no record of this language. And a lot of these languages, linguists have not yet even figured out the grammar systems for them, let alone have the grammars in books so that people can study or preserve. So anyway, last thing, I often say then, we think of the peregrine falcon or the yellow-tailed spotted lizard, and we hear that there's only 2 left, and of course we all rise up and scientists come in, and we know that's a bad thing. If there are a number of trees or flowers or any sort of wildlife that is diminishing, we know that's not a good thing. And yet, when cultures begin to evaporate and disappear in a weird market scheme, that's called progress. Dear speaker, in a future age, when only a handful of tongues remain, I write this to you as a song, even as I know it won't do, even as I know the words I speak are devastation. I don't expect you to understand, but I want you to know there's another language in which I dream. Sometimes I think it's Korean. Other nights, my dead harmony sewing back together a broken room. Or my neighbors, a family of Ojibwas, welding their minivans, cinder blocks teetering. Summer evenings, the Hmong girl and boy echo hide and seek with cousins down the street. Or this spring, Juan, the Mexican kid next door, suddenly 14, shuffling steps on the corner, baggies stuffed in his shorts, truant every afternoon. I see him some days through my window, rapping in a back alley alone in broken English to his iPod, as I've seen him since he was 10, youngest of 4 undocumented brothers in a boarding room basement. I watch through their window well, like an evening TV show whose writers are all angry drunks, and I wonder what will happen to this slightly dumpy boy's heart, out of sync with his tongue. The only 2 muscles you really have to move with wings through this world. A shiny black SUV pulls up each Friday. He climbs in. And I wonder if I did the right thing 3 years back by urging my other neighbor, an old white woman, not to call the cops on him. Dear speaker, in a future age, when only a handful of lexical bouquets remain to light these monstrous highways, I write this to you as a human piece of coal, origin of orange, shelved away in some petrified repository, even as I know it's too late for you to bind and open me, even as I know yet another world language will become extinct this week, forever gone like Atlantis or Montezuma's kingdom, Sumerian, Gothic, Koguryo, Tasmanian, Scots, Gaelic, Mohawk, Iroquois, like a global hurricane of power and indifference, veering toward Flemish and Basque, Ainu, Anishinaabe, and yes, one day, if turnabout is fair play, maybe even this language I tease apart for inconsistencies to house me. I wish I could tattoo this prayer to my poem, even as I know it's way too long, longer than my body, my whole life, this eviscerated pink and black spilling through the forest of my sleep, though yesterday, just another passionate Somali debate awakening me on the 21A. a mismatched couple whispering over borst and pirashki at Komarchek's on Hennepin. Once, some Greek harangue over the baklava's freshness at Bill's imported, "Aw yeah," and the foot thai every Sunday I supersize, whose bony broth brings tears to my eyes in Frogtown. And sometimes I know I'm just another ghost passing through this century, one of a long line of hungry souls before me, each a spiritual refugee. Dear Father who art in heaven, I relinquish you. Dear Father who art in heaven, who fled your homeland, war-torn in flames, I relinquish you from the preterite, spiritual RNA erased by missionaries and sunglass generals, handing out candy, cigarettes, crosses, and European names. Dear future, I'm writing you from an imperfect case in a secret code I've had to reinvent myself with, associations and inflections, rawest of imaginations, a disciple of time in a bulky patois adrift, migrant with no motor, canvas, or oars, only these few city stars, faulty neon thresholds. In truth, only two. Dear time, how I envy the cleanliness of your hands. Dear love, why do I need your shadow so deeply inside mine? I don't know where any of us is going, but I'm sure on the other side of the world there is another language I have never heard. It is beautiful. In this dying tongue, there are words for love and God that resemble bread and wing, or another forest language in which mother and knife equal, drawer, and sing. And island wood is somewhere desert milk, and berry elsewhere is a door. And if you added up all these dying words and the people who speak them, all their memories, histories and lessons, all their gods, jokes, rituals and recipes, if you learned and stirred them over and again until each utterance became a star, a new footprint, the marrow of a poem. Dear speaker, in a future age when not 6,000 or 3,000 or even a dozen, but only one origin of the world remains, I write this to you as an elegy. In the beginning, there was a word, but it got lonely. So it prayed for brothers, sisters, and neighbors until love was born. But along with it came shame, passion, greed, benevolence, and need. And soon, some of the words became flowers and trees, and others animals. And eventually, some were human beings, queens and workers, kings and thieves.